Derek Holt slammed the homeless woman's head against the wall and forced out each word as if spitting in her face. "You black trash. You dare wander near my territory, filth, like you only makes this place dirty." He yanked her collar roughly, then stopped when the torn coat revealed a piece of military gear that could not be fake. A moment later, everything burst open like a triggered charge as she turned out of his grip, her eyes so cold that even Mercer beside them stepped back half a step. The crowd had no time to grasp what was happening before a powerful voice cut straight through the air. "Chief Petty Officer Morris, stand down." Holt froze as if struck with steel. If you were Holt, after mocking, assaulting, and insulting a Navy SEAL in the middle of the street, what path would you have left to run? Follow now, turn on notifications, and comment. What would you do when you witness someone abusing power being exposed? The gray morning settled over the working-class neighborhood in a thin layer of mist. After the night's rain, the pavement still damp and faintly reflecting the first light of the day. In front of the old diner, where early workers stopped for hot coffee and shelter from the sharp cold, Ayla Morris leaned lightly against the brick wall, the quiet posture of a homeless woman who drew no attention. A worn, gray coat draped over her compact frame, her hair still wet and clinging to her forehead as if she had spent the night outside, but her eyes were different, sharp and steady with control, the kind of gaze found only in people trained to read every movement around them. She kept her shoulders relaxed and sometimes drew a deep breath as if bracing against the cold. Yet her awareness swept across every window, every passing car, every unfamiliar face. Inside her coat pocket, her phone vibrated softly. A message appeared without needing a sender's name. "The target has appeared. Hold your position." Ayla closed the screen at once and slipped the phone back exactly where it had been, her expression unchanged, revealing nothing to anyone nearby. Beneath the shabby layers was a body wound tight in a way only someone familiar with battlefield pressure could recognize, ready to respond if the situation turned dangerous. She did not belong to this scene, but the mission required her to stand here in the form of a woman without a home, a forgettable shadow on the street. A long screech of brakes cut through the thin morning quiet. A white and blue police cruiser shot forward and stopped at the curb right beside Ayla, water splashing up in dark streaks across the wet pavement. The door slammed shut, and Derek Holt stepped out with a look that said her presence had already tested his patience. His face carried clear irritation, his eyes holding the judgmental glare Ayla had seen too many times in her years on assignment. In their system, she knew his name well, knew he had once been investigated for assaulting a homeless black man, but had walked away because of the right handshake within the department. The way he looked at her now was no different from someone hunting for an excuse to unload his anger. The 911 call Holt had received was a vague report. "There is a suspicious person lingering in front of the store." No description, no evidence, but for Holtatha it was enough to ignite the prejudice that had lived in him for a long time. His eyes swept over Ayla the way someone might look past an obstacle rather than at a human being. He walked toward her, his boots striking the sidewalk hard, stopping only a breath away from her face. Ayla stayed in place, lifting her chin just slightly to meet his gaze. Part observation, part preparation in case Holt pushed too far. "Why are you standing here?" Holt asked, not with the responsibility of a police officer, but with the weight of an accusation. His voice was thick with hostility, as if her presence were a mistake that needed to be cleared off the street. Ayla did not answer right away, not out of fear or confusion, but because she had to protect the identity her mission required. A homeless woman did not react too quickly or speak too firmly. She let a few seconds pass before replying in a small but steady voice, "I am just keeping out of the wind." That simple answer only irritated Holt more. He stepped closer, crowding her space, examining her like an object. A worn coat, messy hair, eyes that were too calm. That calmness unsettled him because people in weaker positions usually feared him, but she did not. He studied her face, narrowing his eyes as if trying to recall something. He had seen that look somewhere before. Someone who had survived his rough grip, or someone who had stood back up after he tried to push them down. The thought made him even more uneasy. "I have seen eyes like that," Holt said, his voice slow, as if dragging up an unpleasant memory, his expression tightening with resentment. "You look familiar." Ayla still did not react, but her breathing slowed to keep her composure. She knew his words were not because he truly recognized her, but because his prejudice was searching for a foothold to turn into a reason to provoke her. In that moment, before he said more, she sensed the shift in his tone, a slide from suspicion toward hostility. She knew what was coming would not be pleasant. Holt lowered his face a little closer, so Ayla could not avoid his gaze. For a brief instant, she saw something in it, not the firmness of someone doing their duty, but the satisfaction of a man accustomed to using power to push others down. His eyes made it clear he wanted trouble, and she was the target he had chosen to unload his frustration on. She did not step back, did not avoid, but she did not challenge him either. She held the expression of a homeless woman used to enduring things. Every reaction was measured for the mission, every breath, every movement controlled by the experience of a Navy SEAL hidden in plain sight. She knew that if he took one more step, the situation would turn sharply, and that moment was very close. The air between them thickened. The street behind them stayed loud with workers passing by, car doors opening and closing, and the diner door swinging each time a customer walked in. But at this point of contact, right in front of the diner, there were only Ayla Holt and a nameless tension growing larger like a current running through the air. The false calm of the morning slowly cracked along the thin line between them. Ayla looked directly into Holt's eyes and saw his next words pull the air even lower. Holt lifted one corner of his mouth, almost whispering, but carrying in the threat of someone used to crushing others. "I have seen that kind of eye before, and the people who have those eyes usually fight back against me." That moment was the boundary, the signal for the chain of explosions the neighborhood was about to witness. It was also when Ayla clearly felt that her mission would no longer be as simple as observing the target, because another path was beginning right here, as Holt stepped half a step closer to her, pulling the confrontation toward the inevitable. The moment Ayla stood in silence watching Holt ended with a small movement from him, the kind of shift anyone who had lived through dangerous situations as she had would instantly recognize. Holt changed his stance, lowering his shoulders slightly, as if preparing to close in, then stepped forward with the violent confidence of someone used to shaping others with his authority. He kept his mocking tone, but beneath it was an impatience, as if he needed an excuse to turn a simple check into an act of force. He leaned his face closer, studied Ayla for a few seconds, then suddenly reached out, grabbed her collar, and yanked hard enough that her back hit the brick wall behind her. The abrupt pull sent small bits of dust falling onto her shoulders while Ayla kept her gaze steady without a hint of panic, something that only made Holt more irritated. "What are you doing? Stealing? Snooping?" Holt demanded, his voice rising as if the accusation had been decided long before, without any need for evidence or logic. His words cut through the street, drawing the attention of morning commuters hurrying past. A few people slowed down just to be sure they had not misheard. A police officer grabbing the collar of a homeless woman was not unusual in this neighborhood, but the force Holt used was excessive, as if he wanted to leave a mark on the wall to prove his authority. Behind Holt, above the line of sight of most passers-by, an old diner camera continued to operate quietly. It had been mounted there for years, its lens dimmed with age and coated in dust that made it easy to ignore. It sat above the sign pointed directly toward the spot where Holt had pressed Ayla. No one in the small crowd, not even Holt, realized that the entire scene was being captured clearly. The next seconds would become evidence that no excuse could erase. Ayla kept her breathing steady, feeling the rough wall pressing into her back, but her mind stayed cool and calculated. She knew Holt had not used his full strength yet, but the motion he had just made was a warning that he would go further if he felt she was not submitting. She assessed assessed the surrounding distance, the number of people who had stopped, and the curiosity in their eyes. In a few of their faces he saw disapproval, but also caution, because no one wanted to become the next target of a police officer known for trouble. Holt noticed someone beginning to raise a phone. He turned his head and glanced at them, and tension flashed across his expression, although he tried to hide it behind his usual hardness. A regular camera never stopped him, but a smartphone pointed directly at him triggered a memory he had tried to bury for a long time: the assault on Eddie Banks. Back then, he had broken the bones of a homeless black man over baseless suspicion. The clip of that incident had almost spread, almost cost him his job, if not for the familiar hands in the department that wiped the evidence before it reached the public. Now, as he saw a lens aimed at him, that memory bit sharply into his mind, and for a moment he hesitated. But Holt did not back off. He pushed his fear into a new surge of anger. Put the phone down, he growled at the nearest person recording, though his voice was no longer as firm as before. Then, as if to prove he still controlled the situation, he turned back to Ayla and tightened his grip on her collar. Ayla felt each finger clenching through the thin fabric, pulling lightly at the skin of her neck, but she showed no reaction that would feed his satisfaction. She had faced enemies far more dangerous moments where life hung by a thread, and compared to those, Holt's grip felt like a test of how deep her patience ran. Even so, the scene could not continue without shifting into something else. When Holt yanked her a second time, the worn coat, already torn from a previous mission, slipped out of place under the force. It did not rip completely, but enough for the thick fabric underneath to show. The dim morning light struck the distinct outline of the ACU military uniform, making it stand out beneath the shabby coat. Military fabric always had a way of revealing itself, no matter how many layers covered it. Holt needed only a second to notice the difference. His first frown was not suspicion, but confusion. That piece of fabric did not belong to any ordinary homeless person. It was cleaner, thicker, stiffer, with sharp military stitching that could not be mistaken. Holt tugged the coat down a little more to see clearly, and the confusion quickly turned into an effort to understand. He looked at Ayla, leaned in closer, as if trying to gather every clue into one picture. "What is this?" Holt muttered, no longer using the voice of someone questioning a suspect, but the tone of a man trying to match the woman in front of him with the fabric he had just uncovered. The people nearby began murmuring more loudly, unsure what they had just witnessed and what it might lead to. Ayla stayed silent and let Holt sink into his uncertainty. Within that silence, a new tension was rising, ready to push the situation toward an unforeseen direction. The street kept moving as usual, but in the few steps of space in front of the diner, the balance had shifted before anyone realized it. Only Holt, staring at the exposed piece of military uniform beneath the coat, seemed aware that he had just stepped into a dark room he was not sure he should enter or retreat from. In that single moment, everything between them was no longer as simple as checking on a homeless woman. The moment Holt saw the outline of the military fabric under the torn coat changed his attitude. Changed, but not in a softer direction. He did not recognize it as a uniform, nor could he imagine the woman in front of him having any connection to the military, yet the difference irritated him in another way. To Holt, a homeless person had to look worn down, resigned, and fearful of his authority. But Ayla was none of that. Her posture did not collapse, her gaze was far too steady, and that sturdy piece of fabric made it harder to force her into the category of an ordinary homeless person he relied on to keep others in a weaker place. His confusion shifted quickly into suspicion, then into judgment he did not bother to hide. Holt pulled Ayla's coat back up, but did not take his eyes off her face, as if searching for a reason to place her in a group he could handle easily. He leaned closer, his voice tightening with the instinct of someone used to cornering others. "What are you hiding on you?" Holt asked, each word landing like a boot step on wet pavement. "A knife, stolen goods." He stepped slightly to the side, sweeping his eyes up and down her body as though preparing an argument that she must have something suspicious on her. Those questions came not from his duty, but from long-held bias, as if a black person standing alone on the street was a default crime in his mind. Ayla kept her gaze calm and answered in an even, cool voice, neither arguing nor lowering her head. "I am standing here, not harming anyone." The words were quiet but clear, a small anchor in the rising tension. She understood every syllable she spoke had to stay on the thin line between maintaining her homeless cover and not provoking Holt into exploding too soon. She kept her shoulders loose, her breathing steady, always watching the position of Holt's hands and noting escape angles if needed. Farther away, a few people began to stop and watch with a mix of curiosity and caution. Phones were raised again, and the glint of screens added a new spark to the air. But Holt did not look at any of that, or he chose not to. His eyes stayed locked on Ayla, as if searching for a weakness to crush. "Black folks wandering like this always bring trouble," Holt said, a statement soaked in racism, delivered as if it were a simple fact. The air around them dropped another degree. Some of the nearby onlookers seemed moved, but still did not step forward. Those recording lifted their phones a little higher. The city had seen many cases of abuse of power, yet few dared to intervene, knowing such attempts could drag them into danger. Ayla could feel every pair of eyes on them, sensing the shared silence as a kind of waiting to see which way the situation would slide, waiting to see how far Holt intended to push her. She remained calm, but in her eyes there was a slight movement like water beneath ice. Holt's degrading words did not shake the discipline ingrained in her, yet Ayla noted every syllable, every action he made. Moments like this usually passed quickly, but sometimes her silence alone made the other side lose patience and reveal their true nature. Holt straightened up and smirked as if he had found a reason to continue. "Did you hear me clearly? Now I will ask again, what are you hiding from yourself?" He reached toward Ayla's hip to search her, a move that crossed procedure and was meant to humiliate, but the heavy, quick footsteps approaching from behind made him stop instantly. Holt turned irritation in his eyes and was ready to snap at anyone who dared interrupt what he was doing. Another cruiser had just stopped at the curb. The door opened and Brian Mercer stepped out in a hurried stride, adjusting his radio strap, his eyes going straight to Holt. Mercer carried the tired look of someone who had worked a long shift but still had to respond to the call. He took in the scene, Holt pinning a woman against the wall, the crowd forming, phones raised, and his expression shifted within seconds. Mercer did not have Holt's reputation for violence, but he often accompanied him like a shadow forced to follow Holt's lead to avoid trouble. "What are you stirring up now, Holt?" Mercer asked, his tone irritated but not free of caution. The moment the question left his mouth, a few people in the crowd moved slightly closer, as if waiting to see whether anyone arriving would help calm the situation or add more pressure on Ayla. Holt drew in a breath and turned toward Mercer, his posture switching to a guarded stance that marked control. He did not want interference, especially now when he was trying to present himself as the one in charge. Ayla observed Mercer's arrival with necessary caution. His presence would not get her out of the situation because from the way he approached, Ayla knew he was not someone strong enough to stand up to Holt. But his arrival was a signal that the moment was shifting into a new phase, one where Holt would have to assert more force to hold his authority, or Mercer would be pulled in whether he wanted it or not. The air between them held still for a second, and Ayla sensed clearly that a new rhythm of the confrontation was beginning. The moment Mercer stopped beside Holt was the sign that whatever happened next would not be simple, and Ayla understood that Holt's next move would determine the level of explosion the neighborhood was about to witness. Mercer's arrival made the already tense air shift like water hit by a heavy stone. Holt was not comfortable being interrupted in the handling where he held the advantage, and the guarded look he shot Mercer showed that he feared his colleague's presence might restrain the authority he was pressing onto Ayla. But Mercer did not care what Holt thought. He looked from Holt to Ayla, then to the crowd behind them, and at last his gaze stopped on an old man standing at the edge of the sidewalk, not even 3 steps from Ayla. The old man wore a worn brown coat frayed at the elbows, his posture slightly hunched as if trying to retreat from the morning wind. He was not the type to intervene in encounters between police and someone being stopped, but he also did not have the strength to walk away. His eyes held worry when he looked at Ayla, a blend of sympathy and helplessness, the look of someone who had seen injustice often but rarely dared to stand against it. Mercer noticed this immediately and shifted his attention to him. "Do you know her?" Mercer asked, his voice not aggressive like Holt's, but probing as if searching for an answer that could steer the story in another direction. The question startled the old man, his hands trembling enough for those nearby to notice. He had no intention of interfering, but his unfortunate presence had made him another target the 2 officers could turn toward. Walter, the name that fit his bent posture and gentle nature reburied beneath fear, swallowed before answering. "No, I am just watching." His voice sounded like it was carried by the wind, too weak to stand against the weight of the 2 stares fixed on him. He stepped back half a pace by reflex, wanting to escape the attention, yet unable to walk away completely. People around them began murmuring, some exchanging uneasy glances, others shifting their phones to record Walter, as if the story had taken a new turn. Holt shot Mercer a quick glance and then snapped back toward the old man, his expression sinking into something that looked ready to crush any weakness in front of him. "Watching makes you an accomplice," Holt said, each word thrown sharp like stones hitting concrete, making the old man shrink in the literal sense. He stepped right up to Walter, bringing all his hostility and habit of dominance into the space between them. Holt's face came so close that Walter struggled to breathe. The officer's cold breath touched the old man's skin with deliberate force, as if even breath could be used as power. Holt leaned in even closer, his eyes filled with a strange resentment. "Why are you standing here instead of leaving, or are you trying to cover for her?" Walter opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Fear had tightened his throat, and his hands shook with each of his unsteady breaths. He was not used to being questioned, especially by someone like Holt, a man the whole neighborhood disliked, yet no one dared oppose. Mercer stood beside them, watching a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He did not speak up to stop Holt, but the expression on his face showed he recognized that Holt had pushed things too far. Mercer could tolerate Holt's bursts of temper, but seeing an elderly man pressed like that made him pause for a moment, as if something inside him had sparked and died just as quickly under the weight of potential trouble. Ayla watched the entire exchange from where she was pinned against the wall. She could hear Walter's heartbeat rising in his broken breaths. She saw Holt's fingers curl tighter as if ready to grab anyone weaker than himself, and she noticed Mercer take a small step forward, considering stepping in before retreating again when Holt glanced at him. Everything happened fast, but clearly enough for Ayla to understand that the situation had passed its original line. Holt was no longer focused only on her, but had widened his aggression to include an innocent old man. She shifted slightly, not to escape, but to ease the dull ache spreading across her shoulder from being shoved earlier. She kept the calm she needed, but her eyes grew colder and deeper. Holt's actions were one matter, but threatening an elderly man right in front of her was another. He had crossed too many lines at once. What she was witnessing was not just abuse of power, but the pleasure of a man who enjoyed crushing the vulnerable because he believed no one would dare resist. The crowd behind them began to change in mood. They still did not dare intervene, but anger simmered in many faces. It was held down by fear, yet it grew with every breath. People moved slightly closer, held their phones steadier, not just to watch, but as if hoping someone stronger than them would step in, or at least to record the truth so it would not be buried like countless stories before. Holt continued barking at Walter, his voice low but loaded with threat. "When I ask you, answer. Do you know her or not, or are you both hiding something?" Walter shook his head quickly, repeating, "No, I am just watching. But his voice was weaker this time, like his breath was about to break. Just as Holt raised a hand toward Walter's chest as if preparing to shove him back hard, Ayla stepped forward, breaking the narrow space between her and the wall. She did not lunge or rush, but her step carried the decisiveness carved by years in harsh environments. It was enough to shift the air enough to make Holt pause for half a second. Ayla's voice came low but sharp, clear to anyone nearby, and sharp enough for Holt to feel the confrontation truly begin. Do not touch him. It was not pleading, not asking, just a short sentence carrying the weight of someone who would not let injustice advance another inch. In that moment, silence swept the street as if every sound waited to see what Holt would do next. And from here, the story had no way back. The air tightened like a pulled wire the moment Ayla stepped forward to protect Walter, and Holt realized she was not backing down. His eyes shifted from surprise to anger, then to something muddled and hard to read. In Holt's mind, her action was not courage, but defiance. He knew that kind of defiance well, and in his experience it always had to be crushed immediately. He turned to face her, his shoulders tightening like an agitated animal. Then, suddenly, drove his arm forward and shoved Ayla hard into the wall. The force sent a cold brick scraping across her back, a sharp, dry sound echoing loud enough to make a few people in the crowd recoil, while Holt raised his voice as if he meant to command the entire street. "Stay out of this!" he shouted deliberately loud to drown out the whispers around them. He wanted everyone watching to believe he was right, and that he alone had the authority to judge. Ayla steadied herself with one hand on the wall. Her breath pulled tight for an instant, but her eyes did not change. She looked directly at him, silent in a way that seemed to choke Holt's aggression more than any threat could. The woman he wanted to treat as the weaker one showed no fear, and that annoyed him further. He growled and stepped half a step closer as if preparing to press her again, but footsteps behind him made him turn slightly. Mercer approached, no longer standing as far back as before. He looked at Ayla pinned against the wall, then at Holt, and his eyes flickered with something uncertain. Mercer disliked how Holt used force on those weaker than him, but he was not firm enough to stop him outright. His instinct was to focus on the easiest thing he could control in the messy scene, the small backpack that had fallen at Ayla's feet when she was shoved. Mercer bent down, nudged the strap with his boot, then kicked it aside like kicking a bag of trash. The backpack bounced, hit the pavement, and something inside clattered. Mercer picked it up, pulled items out one by one, his voice dripping with contempt as he examined them under the dull morning light. "No ID, nothing at all," he said loudly, making sure the phone's recording could hear him clearly. "Looks exactly like a junkie." The words were aimed not only at Ayla, but at the crowd shaping the story, so she would appear dangerous, a troublesome, homeless woman in their eyes. Ayla watched each item scatter across the ground, an old pair of socks, a small cloth, a few coins, all props she had prepared to fit the identity her mission required. But the way Mercer kicked everything out and displayed it as if exposing something shameful made Ayla feel that this was no longer about staying calm, but about testing the limits of her restraint. She kept her breath steady, looking at the belongings spread across the pavement, and felt something familiar rise inside her, the cruel humiliation often inflicted on those society pushed to its edges. Holt stood beside Mercer, watching him work his expression loosening into satisfaction. He took a deep breath and looked Ayla up and down as if she were an object stripped of dignity. Then he spoke with the cruelty of someone used to driving words into wounds he imagined for himself. "You homeless black people only bring trouble." Holt said the words leaving him light as breath but filled with hatred. The crowd behind them fell silent for a few beats. People had heard lines like this before, but each time it still brought a tight, sick feeling to the chest. Ayla looked at him, her eyes still deep and calm, but behind that calm her mind was running constant calculations. The situation was escalating, and the more aggressive Holt became, the more careful she had to be within the limits of her mission. She could not reveal her skills, could not reveal her identity, and could not take Holt down now. She needed to wait. She needed him to expose more. But the insult he had just thrown out, the contempt toward the vulnerable toward her, and people like Walter made that wait in a sharper test than anything everything she had faced that morning. Mercer kept searching the backpack, pulling items out and tossing them aside. When he lifted a small piece of fabric tucked deep into a corner, he stopped. His eyes shifted with the practiced instinct of an officer used to assessing evidence. He turned the cloth between two fingers, morning light catching the weave line by line. Suspicion appeared across his face as if he had just found something that did not match the story he and Holt were trying to paint about Ayla. "Gang this, Mercer," murmured his voice, dropping as if speaking into himself, yet loud enough for Holt to hear. The scrap of military cloth was not large, but anyone familiar with the military could recognize the texture and pattern immediately. It was nothing like anything a homeless person would carry, nothing like anything belonging to anyone on this street. Mercer looked at Ayla, then at the cloth, then at Holt. His posture was no longer as certain as it had been minutes earlier. Holt glanced over and saw Mercer's expression, then looked at the fabric, then back at Ayla. He almost instinctively moved a little closer, as if forcing a confession out of her. But Ayla's silence only confused him more. She did not flinch, did not deny, did not show anything beyond the steady depth of her gaze. That alone made Mercer furrow his brow again, like a man beginning to realize the story in front of him was not simple at all. In those few seconds, the crowd shifted a little closer, and their attention moved from Holt to Mercer. They wanted to know what had made Mercer stop, what made him stare at the scrap of cloth as if it were a warning sign. A light breeze passed through, scattering a few pieces of paper from the backpack, and for that brief moment the entire street seemed to hold its breath. Holt looked at Mercer as though waiting for an answer, while Mercer kept turning the fabric in his hand, his thoughts moving behind his eyes like a small flame flickering back to life on old ashes. And this was the moment that marked a quiet but decisive shift in the story, when Mercer began to realize that the woman they were trying to crush might not be the helpless person they believed her to be. The moment Mercer began turning the piece of military fabric between his fingers like a fragment out of place, the breaths of the crowd around them seemed to stretch longer. Those recording on their phones leaned forward, trying to see whether that small cloth meant something. Holt kept his dominant posture, but his eyes flicked toward the fabric again and again, as if for a brief second he sensed a vague unease he could not name. Ayla stood upright, her back still aching from the shove, but her gaze stayed fixed on Mercer. She knew exactly what was coming. Moments like this in a mission always marked the crossroads of two paths. Either the secret stayed intact or everything was about to break open. In the rising tension, a small voice cut through the heavy air. It was not strong or sharp, but carried the tone of someone who had once seen something unforgettable. A small figure stepped out of the crowd, moving closer with the caution of a person who had spent years standing behind the world. It was Ruth Parker, the homeless woman often seen on the opposite corner, her eyes always tired, yet strangely perceptive. Ruth stopped barely 2 steps from Ayla, her gaze sliding over the torn coat, then settling on the exposed strip of military cloth. A wave of memory crossed her face, making her dim eyes brighten in an unusual way. She stared at Ayla for a long moment before speaking, her voice soft but trembling with emotion. "I remember you," Ruth said, causing a few people in the crowd to turn toward her. "You were honored once." The words slipped out into the silence, and within seconds every gaze shifted toward Ruth alone. Ayla tilted her head toward the woman, the steel calm in her eyes turning cold like water abruptly frozen. She stepped closer to Ruth, gently enough not to draw unwanted attention, but firmly enough for the woman to understand she had come too close to a dangerous line. Ayla lowered her voice so only Ruth could hear, but the weight of it was unmistakable. "Do not say it." A simple warning, but filled with real concern. She did not want Ruth dragged into this, especially knowing what would follow if the secret broke too soon. Ruth froze, realizing she had stepped into something she should not have. Her hands clasped together, an apologetic look passing over her face, but it could not undo the fact that Holt had heard part of her words, especially with him standing right there, always ready to seize any loose thread to twist the situation back in his favor. "What honor?" Holt asked, his voice stretching with suspicion and challenge, carrying the familiar edge of someone who refused to back down from what he did not understand. He stepped half a pace forward, looking from Ruth to Ayla, and then to the piece of cloth in Mercer's hand. Holt's eyes widened slightly, no longer just irritated but tinged with confusion. Even if he did not recognize military fabric, even if he did not fully understand Ruth's words, he sensed enough to know something had shifted off the track he usually forced others onto. Ruth stepped back on instinct when Holt moved closer, her hands shaking visibly. She had never been someone who confronted others, and the moment that old memory slipped from her mouth, she realized she had stepped far beyond her safe boundary. Ayla's gaze tried to pull her back, but it did nothing to stop Holt from advancing on them. Mercer watched, seeing the fear growing in Ruth's eyes and the tight control in Ayla's face, then looked down at the piece of cloth again. He drew in a breath, but it trembled. The people around them began to sense a change in him. The unconscious aggression from earlier faded, replaced by a conflicted expression as if he were trying to understand something bigger than the scene in front of him. "What honor?" Holt demanded again, louder now, frustrated by the lack of answers. "What are you?" He turned to Ayla, pushing his face closer, trying to catch any shift in her expression. But Ayla stood straight, her eyes unmoving as if none of Holt's motions mattered. That only made Holt more determined to push the situation in the direction he knew best: dominance. Mercer's expression twisted with conflict, his hand tightening around the cuffs he carried. Holt had dragged him into this, and standing before him was a woman who did not resemble any homeless figure he had ever encountered. But the instinct, trained into him for years, urged him to obey, to rebuild the line of control he and Holt stood on. He yanked the cuffs from his belt and stepped forward as if ready to end everything in one move. "On your knees," Mercer shouted, his voice carrying the force of a command meant to silence the doubt forming inside him. He moved closer to Ayla, cuffs raised, repeating the order louder. "On your knees now." But in that moment he glanced toward Walter, hidden behind the crowd, the old man's chest rising unevenly like someone who had just survived a shock. His pale, widened eyes froze in terror, as if the slightest motion from Mercer would make him collapse onto the pavement. Mercer's eyes wavered sharply when he saw Walter so frightened he could barely stand. The situation before him was no longer about arresting a homeless person, but about creating another powerless victim, something Mercer had never intended to do. His hand tightened around the cuffs, but the grip no longer carried the certainty it had when he first raised them. The moment stretched thin like a fragile thread, one light breeze away from snapping, and Mercer stood at the very center of it. He was pulled between two forces, Holt's command on one side and his conscience tugging on the other. And this was the first crack, the place where the story was about to shift into a harsher layer, where power would no longer sit quietly on one side. The hesitation in Mercer's eyes was still hanging there when Holt stepped forward, as if sensing his partner's instability and wanting to seize control again. He moved right behind Ayla without the slightest restraint and suddenly drove his knee hard into her back. The pressure forced her spine to fold by reflex, the air in her chest pushed upward, and the impact triggered a faint metallic sound from her left wrist. It was the strike against the tactical watch beneath her sleeve, a watch that had remained silent through the mission and now flickered awake from a force beyond its threshold. A thin red line, bright as a hairline spark, flashed across the watch face before disappearing, but the signal traveled far. In an instant, at a base miles away, a system lit up with the words, "No commanding officer wanted to see." At that moment, SEAL operative compromised. A dim but unmistakable alert flashed across a large monitor, and the officer on duty immediately escalated the signal. At the exact moment Holt drove Ayla toward the pavement, a sequence of actions elsewhere had been triggered like a chain reaction. But on the street in front of the diner, no one except Ayla knew what had just occurred. Holt pressed harder with his knee, trying to force Ayla lower, as if proving that he alone held authority in front of everyone. "Get on your knees," he shouted, his rage exploding like Ayla had insulted every ounce of power he claimed just by standing upright. The crowd backed away, but no one left. Phones kept recording, and that presence only pushed Holt further into extremity. His mind held no trace of reason now, only layers of hatred tearing open, and the need to force Ayla down at any cost. Ayla felt the pressure drive deeper. Her body pushed past an ordinary threshold of pain. What Holt did not know was that through years of brutal training, she had learned to separate pain from action, to hold on to a mental anchor that kept her from being swept by circumstance. In the moment she made the decision she had been avoiding since the confrontation began. She would counter. Ayla twisted her hips sharply, the movement calculated down to the inch. It happened in less than a heartbeat, so fast that those nearest saw only a clean, decisive shift before Holt's body was thrown off balance. She knocked his arm away with precise force, sending Holt stumbling for a few seconds. His heel scraped across the wet pavement with a sound that cut through the silence blanket in the street like the smooth surface of a lake before a storm. The crowd reacted almost at the same time with sharp breaths. A few people raised their phones higher, their hands shaken in surprise. Mercer flinched, one hand rising on instinct as if ready to intervene, but he did not take another step. He just stood frozen, his eyes still caught in the uncertainty sparked by the military fabric. Holt, meanwhile, pushed himself upright with difficulty, his face flushed with rage, as if his pride had just been snapped in half. "You're tackling a cop," Holt yelled, his voice cracking no longer the tone of someone in control, but of a man humiliated in front of a crowd. He lunged at Ayla again, but this time his aggression lacked the absolute confidence it had before. It was tainted by something he tried to hide, but could not, the fear that she was not who he thought she was. Ayla kept just enough distance, her breathing steady. Her counter, a moment ago, had not been strong enough to expose her identity, only enough to push Holt away. Yet it was precise enough that anyone with military training could recognize the technique. That only made Holt more confused, because he could not fit the image of a homeless woman with that kind of skill. But he refused to accept the possibility because admitting it meant he had made a much bigger mistake than he wanted to believe. The situation was on the edge of chaos when something no one expected happened. Walter, the old man beside them, who had been so frightened he nearly collapsed when Mercer raised the cuffs, suddenly stepped forward. He was not strong, not fast, and every step he took was slow and shaken, like a man walking through cold, deep water. But he stepped forward anyway, and that alone made several people in the crowd widen their eyes, because they knew Walter had never confronted a police officer, not even in the smallest way. He stood directly in front of Ayla, his narrow shoulders pulling together as if to shield her from Holt's next charge. His voice shook so hard he had to speak twice before the words came out. "Stop this," Walter said, his breath broken. She did nothing wrong. The entire sentence fell heavy like a knock on the pavement, each word pushed out by someone who had never stood up for anyone in his life. The crowd around them nearly stopped breathing. Phones pointed at Walter at the thin back, standing between someone pushed to the edge and a police officer losing control. The sight cut through the darkest part of the scene like a blade, revealing a brief light sharp enough to stir anyone with a conscience. Mercer watched Walter standing there, and his eyes shifted violently. In that moment, he no longer saw a suspect, an offender, or a homeless woman. He saw an old man, trembling yet still standing between harm and the one being harmed. And that image cracked open the core of his conscience, as if a piece of decency he had let Holt bury long ago had begun to surface again. The moment Walter stepped forward became the last thread holding the entire storm at its boundary, and from he nothing would ever be the same. The moment Walter stepped in front of Ayla sent an undercurrent through the crowd, a shift no one voiced but everyone felt. People moved slightly closer, not to intervene, but to witness every second of what was unfolding. Phones were held steadier lenses pointed at the three people at the center of the storm: Holt, with his twisted anger, Ayla standing silent like steel in cold wind, and Walter trembling yet firm as if using the last strength of his life to remain upright. Minutes earlier, only one person had been live streaming the incident. But when Ayla countered with precise movement, and when Walter dared to stand between them, that live stream spread across neighborhood groups and then to the personal pages of those who had witnessed abuse of power in the area before. And, like every injustice given a clear shape, it drew viewers faster than any breaking headline. The viewer count climbed by the second comments streamed across the screen of the person recording, and the murmurs from the crowd turned into overlapping voices. Someone leaned toward the person beside them and whispered, "She does not look like someone from the streets." Another added, "I saw her jacket slip earlier, looked like military." And then the phrase slipped out from someone farther back, small at first, like a breath before traveling fast as sparked fire. "She might be military for real." Ayla heard those words, and though she did not turn to look at the crowd, she felt the wave of suspicion spreading. Each sentence was like a flashlight beam cutting through the darkness she had been trying to hide in, and she knew it could not be stopped much longer. Holt heard it too, and the doubt twisting through him warped the aggressive mask he wore. He looked at Ayla, then at the crowd, then at the piece of military cloth still in Mercer's hand, his eyes widening with the uncertainty he refused to acknowledge. At that moment, a faint sound rose from far down the street unnoticed at first, the low, steady hum of an engine moving at a controlled speed. A few seconds later, it grew louder, clearer, overriding both the murmurs and the sharp breaths around them. A black SUV rolled to a stop at the curb, no siren, no unnecessary noise, but carrying a presence that lowered the volume of the entire street in a single beat. The door opened. From the instant that the black panel swung outward to the moment a boot touched the pavement, the crowd fell silent as if a hand had pressed gently on their shoulders to remind them not to make a sound. The person who stepped out was tall, broad-shouldered, with the set face of someone who had completed too many missions to care about the noise of the outside world. Commander Elias Hayes did not arrive dramatically, but his presence alone was enough to create a compressed shockwave at the center of the street. He walked straight ahead, his eyes neither confused by the chaos, nor angry, nor uncertain. There was only the focus of an officer accustomed to responding to the red alert his system had sent to the base not long before. Each step he took carried a steady rhythm, and in that rhythm lived the years of command, the rescues, the decisions made when the lives of his teammates hung in the balance. Mercer was the first to turn hesitating, as if seeing someone from a different world. Holt jerked back half a step, unsure what posture he should take in front of a stranger, stepping out of a sleek vehicle that looked nothing like anything belonging to this working-class neighborhood. But Ayla knew. The moment she saw Hayes's stance, she recognized the invisible order settling over her. She stood straighter, the pain in her back and shoulder slipping behind her awareness. All the tension built up until now pulled inward, not disappearing but compressing into a firm line in her eyes. Hayes stopped directly in front of Ayla, tilting his head slightly as if to confirm her condition. His expression was stern but held no reprimand, only the certainty that he had arrived at the right place at the exact moment the system required him to. He drew a breath, and his voice cut through the silence with a force that carried unmistakable authority. "Chief Petty Officer Morris, stand down." The words hit the street like a hammer, sharp and final, stopping every sound around them. Ayla bowed her head slightly by reflex, not out of mere obedience, but out of respect for her commander, a man who never appeared on scene unless the situation had moved beyond the expected. From the crowd came a wave of gasps. Phones jerked higher, their screens shaking in the unsteady hands of those recording. Mercer stood frozen. The piece of military cloth slipped from his fingers without him noticing, his eyes locked on Hayes, as if waiting for someone to tell him he had misunderstood. Holt went completely pale. The skin on his neck trembled like someone who had just stepped off a ledge into empty space. He looked at Ayla from head to toe, then at Hayes, then back at Ayla with a terror no words could capture. And then the sentence the entire street had been waiting for fell from Holt's mouth like a breath cut in half. Chief. He swallowed, hard, eyes wide, Navy, SEAL. The neighborhood erupted in the next instant, and that was the moment every bit of power Holt had ever clung to shattered beneath his feet. The appearance of Commander Elias Hayes changed the atmosphere on the sidewalk in front of the diner like a cold wind cutting through a summer day. The title he addressed Ayla with did not need repeating for anyone to understand that the entire situation had shifted completely. The shouting, the aggression, the forceful shoves against the pavement, all of it suddenly became jagged pieces stuck in Holt's throat. He stepped back, half a pace like someone who had slipped into a drop he never knew existed. Mercer stood as if nailed to the ground, his eyes locked on the insignia on Hayes's uniform, as though closing his eyes might return him to the ordinary reality of minutes before. Holt spoke first, but the sound that came out was more like two pieces of metal, scraping together than a coherent sentence. He looked at Ayla, then at Hayes, his face drained of color, pulled tight between fear and confusion. "We did not know," Holt said, the explanation trembling like someone standing before a judge. "She looked homeless. We only—" He stopped because no word he could choose would fail to condemn him. The excuses that had helped him dodge responsibility in past incidents were useless here, not in front of someone with Hayes's rank and not with the truth recorded on every phone capturing the scene. Hayes looked at Holt with the quiet severity of someone who had seen too many failures to need to raise his voice. His eyes were not narrowed, not angry, but cold enough to make Holt miss a breath. When Hayes spoke, his voice did not need to rise yet, carried the weight of steel set on a table. "You have just interfered with a national operation." Each word was clear and left no room for misunderstanding, and acted far beyond anything the law permits. The statement landed not only on Holt, but on the crowd pressed behind him. Those who had been confused by the earlier chaos now felt anger rising in every whispered word. Someone in the crowd said, "My God, they assaulted a Navy SEAL." Another voice followed, shaking with rage. "Abuse of power." A third rose and was quickly echoed by others, arresting the innocent. Within seconds, the anger, long buried in this neighborhood, a place that had witnessed too many injustices without any power to stop them, burst into a wave. For the first time that morning was no longer the one in control. He became the center of a widening circle of guilt and harm, a circle built from years of his own misconduct. Phones lifted higher, some people calling friends to watch others streaming the stream of someone else, the noise swelling in rolling bursts. Mercer looked around, his chest tightening at every shout from the crowd. He remembered the moment minutes earlier when he had tightened the cuffs and seen Walter trembling as if facing death. All those images rushed back at once, hitting him like a reel of film he could not turn away from. Mercer stepped back half a pace, realizing he had crossed far beyond any line he could justify. Hayes stepped forward a small distance, standing between Ayla and the two officers. He did not need to raise a hand or display authority. His presence alone was enough to reset the entire order of the scene. He looked at Holt, then at Mercer without asking a single question, yet his eyes seemed to weigh every action they had taken from the start. The silence locked both of them in place like children caught misbehaving. Behind him, Ayla stood slightly bowed in a regulation posture. But in the dim gray morning light, people could still see the defined strength beneath her torn coat. The whispers in the crowd continued. "I knew it. She never looked like someone homeless. When she countered him, I suspected they really hit a female SEAL." The anger of the community rose like a flame fed by the wind. A young woman nearby looked straight at Holt and shouted, "Now you know how it feels to be pushed down by you." A middle-aged man beside her added, "About time this stuff comes to light." Those words no longer stayed restrained. They broke free from people who had endured too long, and once released, they could not be pulled back. All the tension in the air gathered into a single sharp point when a familiar sound crackled from Holt's radio. A small burst of static turned into the clipped voice of the station dispatcher. The sound was loud enough for the entire crowd to hear Holt Mercer. "Report back to headquarters immediately." 4 words cut through the scene like a blade. The citizens paused in unison, then several people laughed under their breath. A young man at the back said, "That is it. No more running." Another voice followed, "Let us see how they explain this at the station." Holt heard the order, and his hand clenched at his side, his knuckles bone white. He looked at Hayes, then at ALA, then at the Crow, recording him as if searching for a hole to crawl into. But there was no escape. Everything he had done on this gray morning had opened a door he could never close. Mercer swallowed hard and lowered his head as if seeing the road ahead branching in a direction he had never imagined, but no longer had any right to protest. Hayes said nothing when the radio crackled. He simply stood there, looking at Holt with eyes that told the entire street that the power had fully shifted. From her the story would no longer be in the hands of those who abused it. The moment fell heavy and sharp like a blade. Everyone understood this was only the beginning of the consequences Holt and Mercer could not avoid. Whispers still rose from every direction as the order for Holt and Mercer to return to headquarters dropped into the thick air. Yet, in the middle of the chaos, Isla stood still beside Hayes as if the eye of the storm had settled behind her. Hayes's arrival had not only reversed the situation but also opened the door she had been waiting for at the exact right moment. Now, with Holt no longer able to shout with Mercer staring at his own feet as though avoiding the light of a conscience newly awakened, and with the crowd finally witnessing the full truth of the gray morning, Ayla knew the time had come. She straightened, steadying the breath that had been forced from her by the blows against the wall and Holt's knee. Her eyes met Hayes's for a brief moment, and his small deliberate nod gave her permission to begin. Ayla stepped forward, standing clearly between the 2 officers and the entire neighborhood. Her voice rose not loudly, but clearly like a bell striking through the silence the crowd held. Reporting. Ayla set her gaze on Hayes, but loud enough for everyone to hear. A drug network operating behind the diner. Night operations under the cover of a food storage facility with 2 hidden entry points behind the dumpster and beneath the supply room. Her words were clipped and precise, each one carrying the weight of an investigation already carved into her mind. Primary target appeared this morning. I held the position as ordered. Another wave moved through the crowd. Residents who had suspected for months that something illicit was happening in the neighborhood now stared wide-eyed, shocked that behind the diner they visited daily lay the center of an operation large enough to require SEAL involvement. Those recording tightened their grip on their phones, sensing the story unfolding into something far bigger than they had imagined. Hayes listened without interrupting, his expression sharpening with each detail Ayla delivered. When she finished, he stepped forward a short distance and spoke with a voice shaped by both discipline and the protective weight he carried for those under his command. "This operation has been monitored for 3 months," he said, each word dropping like an anchor securing the truth she had just revealed. "The trafficking ring links to 2 other districts using forced labor and routing illegal substances through residential areas." He glanced at Holt and Mercer, and the look was cold enough to shorten their breath. "And you 2 nearly compromised the entire mission." Holt opened his mouth as if to argue, but no sound escaped. His face locked in place, replaying every second of the morning as if each moment were an accusation he could not erase. When Hayes finished speaking, the crowd burst again, this time not only with outrage but with realization. A middle-aged woman shouted, "My God, they assaulted someone on active duty." A man yelled, "They interfered with the national operation." "How are you still standing there?" Yelling voices rose around them, echoing through the street in a mountain wave. Mercer stepped farther back when he heard the word operation. Pieces in his mind began falling into place with sharp clarity. Ayla's precise counter, the military fabric in his hand, her unflinching composure even when forced to the pavement. He understood that everything he thought he knew about her was wrong, and the worst of it was that his actions stood on the line of resisting a federal force. Mercer lifted his head to look at Hayes, then at Ayla, and shame, mixed with panic, hit him so fast his eyelid twitched. Amid all the noise, a trembling voice rose from the left side of the crowd. Walter, who had stood in front of Ayla in the moment he dared face cruelty, stepped forward another half step. His face was still pale, his breath still shaken, but his eyes carried relief and gratitude. He looked at Ayla for a long moment before speaking. "If not for you," Walter said, his voice catching as if each word snagged in his throat. "If not for you, I would have—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to because everyone understood the rest. If Ayla had not stepped up to protect him, if she had not faced Holt with unshaken calm, Walter might have become another name, buried in a report full of parentheses, another person disappearing into the cracks of the neighborhood without remembrance. Ayla looked at him with eyes softened slightly, the constant edge in her expression easing like water settling after wind. "As long as you are safe," she said quietly, and the words made Walter exhale as if releasing a weight he had carried without knowing. Hayes watched the two of them, his eyes lowering a fraction before sharpening again. He understood clearly the role of people like Walter in neighborhoods strained under abuse of authority. Living witnesses were often the ones who suffered the most. Hayes stepped forward, placed a firm but gentle hand on Walter's shoulder, and said, "You stood in the right place." The sentence was short, but carried enough meaning to make Walter nod despite the tears gathering in his eyes. After that moment, Ayla turned back to Hayes slow and steady. Their eyes met in a silence lasting several beats, the kind of signal shared between people who had spent hundreds of hours training together and needed no words. Then Ayla spoke, her voice dropping lower. "I can confirm the target's identity and the full layout of the network." Hayes nodded, ready to move to the next phase of the mission, when a sudden sound from behind drew all their attention. It was Walter exhaling with effort, yet more solid than before. He looked at Hayes, then at Ayla, and spoke a sentence that made the entire street fall silent for exactly 1 second. "I will testify." No one spoke immediately. Mercer stood frozen. Holt stared at the old man as if unable to understand how someone who once trembled under his hands could ever stand up again. The crowd stirred this time, not in fear but in respect. An elderly woman whispered, "That is brave." A young man added, "He is going to save this whole place." And in the middle of the packed circle of people, Walter stood, small but unshaken, committing himself with a voice that trembled yet remained clear. His words did not merely close a long morning. They opened the door to an investigation capable of sweeping through all the darkness in this neighborhood. It was the cliffhanger everyone felt at once. The truth had been spoken, and from here on there would be no turning back. That day, when the crowd had finally thinned, Holt and Mercer were taken back to headquarters under an urgent order, and Law was escorted by Hayes into a separate office deep inside the police building. The room was cold and clean, a sharp contrast to the chaos on the sidewalk that morning. The door closed behind them just enough to block the hallway noise, leaving a quiet space where the hum of the air conditioner echoed clearly. Inside, the internal affairs team was already waiting. They did not carry the expression of people caught up in the shock of the incident, but the calm, razor-sharp demeanor of those accustomed to handling misconduct within the force. At the center of the room was a large screen displaying 2 video windows side by side. One was the live stream recorded by civilians. The other was footage from the diner's old camera, the angle high, the lighting dim, but clear enough to capture every yank on Ayla's coat, every second Holt forced her against the wall, every step Mercer used to kick her backpack. The IA team watched the opening sequence repeatedly, slowing each second, as if examining a chain where even one missed link would leave a major gap in the truth. When an investigator paused at the frame where the military fabric was exposed, the entire room seemed to focus on a single point. The truth was right there. Nothing Holt had claimed over the radio about a resisting, suspicious individual appeared in the footage. Another investigator opened a file and questioned Ayla in a steady voice, neither raised nor blindly accepting Ms. Morris recount the full event from the beginning. Leave nothing out. Ayla looked directly at him. She did not waver. The way she stood and the way she spoke was not the posture of someone defending herself, but the clarity of someone who understood every step she took and why it had to happen. She described receiving the assignment, the message about the target's appearance, the position she held, and Holt approaching out of procedure. When she mentioned the knee strike that activated her tactical watch's SOS, she spoke as though reading a mission report, but IA understood it meant a genuine threat. An investigator replayed the part where Holt grabbed her collar, then slowed the scene where Walter was cornered, his voice trembling, and Ayla stepped forward to protect him. "This is why you countered?" he asked. Ayla nodded once. If I had not acted, he would have been hurt. Her voice held no pride or defense. It was simply the truth. A few people in the room exchanged glances, not because they doubted her, but because they were beginning to understand how severe the officer's actions had been. Mercer was brought in afterward. He sat down, his hands clenched on his knees like someone who had fallen into a deep hole too suddenly. The white overhead light shone directly on his face, revealing every tense line. An investigator asked bluntly, "Officer Mercer, why did you participate in an improper use of force?" Mercer looked up, his eyes slightly red from hours without rest. He drew in a breath and answered in a voice weaker than he expected, I was just following Holt's orders." The words he spoke made the room pause for half a beat. It was not an excuse, but sounded like the confession of someone who had realized he had followed the wrong path for far too long. An investigator lowered his head to take notes while another asked, "Did you recognize that Holt's actions were outside the scope of duty?" Mercer swallowed, closed his eyes for a second, then opened them. "Yes," he admitted. "I knew it was beyond. His voice tightened. I did not want to confront him." The moment touched a sensitive thread in everyone present. Anyone in the field understood how powerful the fear of an abusive superior could be. But that did not reduce Mercer's culpability. It only made the truth sharper and heavier. Mercer bowed his head toward the table. His hands clasped no longer the loyal partner Holt once relied on. His expression showed he was no longer standing with Holt. The line between them had been severed not by IA, but by the urgency of Mercer's own conscience. As Mercer finished speaking, an investigator in the corner opened another file. He placed it on the table and slid it toward the IA lead. His expression tightened as though he had seen something capable of shifting the direction of the investigation immediately. The lead investigator opened it, flipped through a few pages, then looked up at the screen, frozen at the moment Holt slammed Ayla against the wall. Inside were multiple incidents, a complaint from the previous year filed by Eddie Banks, a medical report for a homeless young man with a broken arm, a disciplinary record stalled in processing, and internal reports unsigned and passed from desk to desk as though no one dared touch them. The entire room went silent, not in surprise, but because the file was too full to pretend this was merely a misjudgment on duty. A bold line on the first page made the air feel heavy pattern of excessive force. One investigator murmured, cold as a blade, "He has done this for years." The way IA looked at Holt from that point on no longer resembled how they looked at an officer. It was the way one looked at a rotted rope that everyone knew would snap eventually. Ayla remained silent, standing straight beside Hayes, fully aware of what was unfolding. All the truths the neighborhood had whispered about were now being laid out with objective evidence. And that was the cliffhanger. This phase of the investigation revealed they had not seen everything, because when the investigator turned to the last page, his eyes paused, narrowed slightly. Then he placed the page on the table, looked directly at Hayes, and said a line that froze the entire room for a full second. "We found another concealed violence file, more severe than anything in the report." The silence fell like a heavy door sliding into place, and everyone understood that that from here the story would reach far beyond a single act of misconduct. The investigation did not stop at the clips or Mercer's admission. When Holt's old files were laid out on the table, IA understood they had to trace every fragment this officer had left behind through years of abuse. And one of the first names that surfaced, forcing the team to make immediate contact, was Eddie Banks, the homeless man Holt had once beaten so severely that his bones were fractured in an incident later scrubbed from the final report. A vehicle was dispatched to the shelter, where Eddie stayed carrying 2 investigators and the resolve required to touch another part of the truth, the part that had long sunk beneath pages wiped clean of their stains. Eddie sat on a plastic chair outside the shelter, thin, but with eyes far clearer than one might expect of a man who had once been hospitalized after a beating. When IA explained why they were there, Eddie froze for a moment, his hand tightening around the edge of the chair like someone standing at the edge of a memory he did not want to revisit, but also could not abandon. After several seconds of silence, he gave a small nod and motioned them into the small room inside. The space was poor but tidy, the warm yellow light from the overhead bulb casting long shadows across his face, deepening the lines carved by exhaustion. One investigator began softly. "We need to hear your story. We believe it is directly connected to what happened this morning." Eddie looked down at his hands, then back up, his gaze resting on the investigator, as if weighing whether to exhume pain or let it continue sleeping where he had tried to bury it. But when he recalled the footage of Ayla being dragged, shoved against the pavement, the decision became clear. He exhaled and began. "He said I did not deserve to breathe in this neighborhood," Eddie said, his voice steady but heavy like a brick dropping to the floor. "That day I was looking for food. I had not done a thing. I did not even get a word out before he asked where I lived, why I was here. Then he shoved me against the wall as he did to her." He tilted his head toward the phone IA had set on the table, the screen frozen on the image of Holt gripping Ayla's collar. Just like that. He looked at me exactly the same way. IA listened without interrupting. Eddie continued, his voice growing heavier as the memory sharpened. "I asked why he was doing it. He said straight out that I did not deserve to exist in this place, that people like me only made the streets dirty." Then he slammed me to the ground. My elbow broke right then. He touched his left arm where bone had once been set with a brace. He said I fell on my own. Then he forced me to sign a statement. Eddie gave a small, hollow laugh. "Who would not sign? I just wanted to get out of that interrogation room. I wanted to stay alive." An investigator leaned forward slightly and asked very gently, "Was there anyone who witnessed it?" Eddie shook his head. No one dared. They were scared. They knew he had friends above him. I knew that too. So I did not file anything. But I did not forget. He looked toward Ayla onto the screen, his eyes seeming to connect their 2 separate wounds. She stood up. That was something I did not have the strength to do. Ayla stood with her shoulder lightly against the wall in the corner of the room, listening to every word Eddie recounted through the device. She said nothing, but her face grew colder with each passing moment, not from surprise, but because everything aligned with what she had sensed from Holt the moment he approached her that morning, the contempt in his voice, the hateful shove, and the way he carried himself as if others were born beneath him. Now she was hearing a victim confirm it, and in Ayla's eyes there was a sharp light like a blade, the kind of light that appears only when a warrior recognizes a truth they are obligated to confront. An investigator placed the old file on the table and flipped back to the page describing Eddie Banks's case. The file contained only a thin dismissive line claiming the victim injured himself while fleeing. No one in the room spoke right away. The silence was not due to a lack of words, but because too much anger was pressing to surface. The lead investigator closed the file and exhaled like someone who had just seen the final piece of a dark puzzle slide into place. He rose, set both hands on the table, and spoke in a low but firm voice. "That is enough." Eddie looked at him, unsure what enough meant in this context, but he could feel something shifting powerfully inside the room. Another investigator asked, "Are you willing to testify?" Eddie blinked several times, then nodded. "If she can stand like that, then I will do my part." Ayla did not smile or nod, but through her eyes Eddie understood that Walter's decision to stand up earlier was not an isolated act. It had spread through the neighborhood without anyone noticing, reaching even those who believed their courage had long since been worn away. IA ended the session by collecting the full statement and confirming continued contact with Eddie. As they left, the oldest investigator spoke to the others, his words setting the trajectory for the entire case. "We are no longer looking at a personal mistake. This is a pattern of systemic abuse, and it will be brought to light." They returned to headquarters with a report that had grown several pages thicker, burdened with truths no one wanted to face, but now had no choice but to acknowledge. In the investigation room, Holt's file was opened again and placed beside Eddie's recorded testimony. The picture became clearer and darker, and at the moment they prepared to combine the files for submission to the district attorney, IA placed a single sheet on the table with a title so stark that no one in the room could maintain their usual composure: Recommendation for Criminal Prosecution of Officer Derek Holt. When IA completed the first portion of the file and prepared to move into the prosecution phase, another turning point unfolded right in the neighborhood that had witnessed everything. News that Ayla was a Navy SEAL spread quickly like a cold wind, sweeping through porches, alleyways, and the wary glances of residents who had long grown used to feeling small before authority. The abuse of power was not only exposed but awakened something the neighborhood believed had gone dormant: the courage of people who had stayed silent. And among those who began to follow the case, the two most crucial witnesses arrived in the middle of IA's meeting. Eddie Banks was brought in first. Stepping inside the police station made his facial muscles tense for a moment, like someone entering a place that had once hurt him badly enough to remember forever. But he did not turn away. His steps were steadier than when IA met him at the shelter. His eyes did not avoid anyone, but fixed directly on the investigator's nameplate, like a man who had decided he would not let his voice be crushed again. Walter arrived a few minutes after Eddie guided into the room by Hayes. The old man was still trembling, but his posture carried a resolve he never believed he could hold. He placed a hand on the edge of the table, inhaling deeply to steady himself before he sat down. When the investigator asked directly, "Are you both willing to testify?" the room seemed to hold its breath. Eddie did not look at anyone but Ayla, who stood in the corner. He did not know how to put into words what he saw in her, but he knew clearly that her calm that day had not only saved her, but also saved the old man who had stepped forward to shield her. Eddie nodded once, firm and unmistakable, like a seal stamped in permanence. "I'll speak." Everything he said, his voice rough but solid, like someone signing his name in blood. Walter was slower by a few seconds. He glanced at Ayla, then at the image of the handcuffs Holt had raised in his face that morning, a picture still lingering in his mind like a wound not yet closed. Remembering her faint smile when she stood up for him felt like someone placing a hand on his back and giving a gentle but steady push. The investigator repeated the question for clarity. "Mr. Walter, do you want to participate as a witness in the proceedings?" Walter set his hand on the table, his fingers trembling, but his answer did not. "Yes, I will testify." His voice was not loud, but carried enough strength for everyone to hear. The response made Ayla lift her head, her eyes softening for a brief, rare moment. His presence was not only that of a crucial witness, but a victory over the very thing Holt had spent years trying to crush: the dignity of the powerless. Eddie turned to Walter and placed a hand on his shoulder. A light touch weighed down with the shared understanding of two people who had both been trampled under the same boot of authority. After recording their agreement, IA let them watch the diner camera footage from an angle they never knew existed. Both men stared at the moment Holt yanked Ayla's collar, at the second she was forced onto the wet pavement, and at the image of Walter standing between her and the raised handcuffs. Eddie turned away for a breath, like someone trying to avoid the sting of old anger flaring up again. Walter swallowed through a wave of trembling. "I did not think they would do that to a service member," he said quietly, but enough for IA to understand that the shock rippling through the neighborhood was far greater than what made the news. The door opened when Ruth Parker was brought in. She walked with the weary gait of someone who had carried too many years of exhaustion, yet her shoulders straightened the moment she saw Ayla. Ruth moved to her without hesitation, placing a hand over Ayla's with more strength than her age and circumstances suggested. "You stood up, so we will too," she said. Her eyes glistened, her voice was rough, but each word carried the weight of feelings she had been forced to bury. Those in the room understood she was not a central witness to the morning incident, but a living witness of how this community had been treated for years. Her words would not appear in any legal document, but they became part of the emotional backbone of the case. Ayla looked at her without responding. She did not need to speak. Her eyes said everything. It was not the pride of someone vindicated, but the acknowledgement that everyone in the room had value, had a voice, and that this time their voices would be heard. The only gesture Ayla gave was a slight nod, a nod strong enough to draw the first small smile from Ruth after months of fearing the world around her and fearing the things she could not name. The entire room went silent for a few seconds, as if everyone needed to absorb everything that had happened since morning. Then IA resumed the meeting, comparing statements, marking critical points to prepare for the legal phase. The air was heavy, but no longer chaotic. It was the heaviness of an investigation finally moving in the right direction, the weight of justice being pulled out of the dark. As Ayla stepped back from the group, preparing to leave so Hayes could escort her to the military facility, she saw Mercer standing in the hallway by the exit. He leaned lightly against the wall, hands clasped in front of him like someone torn between choices, like someone waiting for permission to speak. Mercer looked at Ayla for a long moment, as if searching her eyes for the answer to what he should do next. When she approached, he inhaled deeply and exhaled in the slow, unsteady breath of a man who had finally reached the bottom of a long descent. Ayla did not speak first. Hayes behind him remained silent as well, but that silence made it impossible for Mercer to hold back any longer. He looked down, then lifted his head, his expression strained. He started, then stopped swallowing again. He felt the weight of every step he had taken in the wrong direction. "I do not want to be pulled along with him anymore." That sentence was weak but true, and more importantly, it marked exactly what IA had been waiting for since the start of the investigation. When Mercer lifted his eyes to look directly at Ayla, that look no longer tried to justify anything or turn away. It was the look of a man standing on the final edge between the truth and the things he had once been pushed to follow. His voice dropped rough and low, but this time it did not shake. "I will testify to everything." When Mercer finally said he would tell everything, the entire investigation felt as if it had been pushed past a new threshold. But the reach of the truth did not stay inside the IA meeting room or within the statements exposing the darkest parts of Holt. It was erupting outside those walls, beyond the cold concrete and the paper-filled hallways. It began with the phones raised that morning, then with the live stream from the student standing at the curb and the images of Holt grabbing Ayla's collar and forcing her onto the wet pavement spread faster than any official report ever could. In only a few hours, that live stream was no longer the story of one neighborhood. It had become a boulder rolling down the slope of an entire state. Large community pages shared the video at a speed no one had seen before. Each reshared post came with a new caption, a sigh, a burst of anger, or a call to stand up. A cop assaulted a homeless woman and then found out she was a Navy Navy SEAL on assignment appeared on hundreds of posts, followed by thousands of comments. Viewers paused what they were doing to watch Ayla standing in the center of a storm of abuse and how she stayed composed through all of it. Many replayed the moment Walter stepped in front of the handcuffs, watching it a second and third time before exhaling. It was the moment when fragility turned into strength and it spread like water sinking into dry ground. Within 2 hours, major civil rights groups began attaching hashtags and sending emails demanding an independent inquiry. Human rights attorneys shared the video and noted that the incident showed signs of assault, racial discrimination, and obstruction of a federal operation. They looked at the moment Holt shoved Ayla into the wall and saw more than an isolated event. They saw a familiar pattern that had been allowed to survive for far too long. One attorney wrote, "The victim today is a Navy SEAL, but yesterday and tomorrow, who will it be? How many people have never had that kind of luck to be recognized?" A civil rights organization hosted a live broadcast analyzing every second of the footage. When the diner camera, the objective evidence Holt never knew existed, was released, the view count surged. In that footage, the first yank to her collar, the second shove to her shoulder, and Holt's words, "You homeless, black people only bring trouble," made many viewers click away for a moment, maybe to swallow the heaviness rising in their chest. Many commented that without the camera, the wrong would have been twisted into the right, like so many times before. Pressure from the public rose like a fast-building wave, and, like any large wave, it crashed hard into the highest levels of power in the city. The police chief received nonstop calls from reporters and from representatives of independent oversight groups. An emergency meeting was held. The air in the room grew thick, faces tightened, and everyone understood that staying silent now would be suicide. At last, after hours of being forced into a corner, the police chief had to step in front of the cameras. He stood against the blue backdrop of the conference room, his face trying to hold steady, though his eyes betrayed fatigue. The lights shone directly on him, and the clicking of cameras surrounded him as if marking every breath. "We apologize to the community for what occurred this morning," he began, his voice low, like someone swallowing both disappointment and helplessness. "The actions of the officers involved are being investigated seriously. No one stands above protocol. No one is allowed to act outside the law." He acknowledged openly that Navy SEAL Ayla Morris had been carrying out an official mission and that Holt and Mercer had committed severe violations. The press conference aired live. On social media, viewers reshared the apology with thousands of different reactions. Some were furious, some relieved, but no one believed it was enough. An apology could not erase the bruises on Ayla's hands or the fear in Walter's eyes. An apology could not undo the years Eddie had lived with pain from a buried incident. But, at the very least, it opened a door for the community to continue demanding justice they had waited far too many years for. While the public storm churned like it wanted to pull the entire city into its vortex, Mercer was called back in by IA. He entered the investigation room with the expression of a man carrying a heavy stone inside his chest. He knew his testimony would decide not only Holt's fate, but also his own. Under the stark white lights, he sat down and stared toward the corner he used to look at when he was a new officer. In that moment, it felt like two paths of his life were splitting before him, one silent and turned away from the truth, the other honest and leading him straight into the consequences. The investigator began with the same question as before, but this time Mercer heard it with a completely different tone. "Officer Mercer," the investigator said slowly, "is there anything you would like to add about this morning's incident?" Mercer drew in a long breath as if trying to clear out every trace of residue fear had left inside him over the years. He looked down at his hands, then lifted his head, his eyes no longer avoiding anything. He said, his voice a little unsteady but not lost. "I want to clarify what Holt did to Mr. Walter." The room went still. No one interrupted him. He continued pulling the words from deep in his chest. Holt forced me to frame him. This morning me to claim that Mr. Walter interfered, but the man did nothing. A long silence passed after that statement. Mercer closed his eyes and opened them again like someone stepping onto the side of a line he had never dared to cross before. It was not an excuse. It was not an apology. It was the truth that everyone in the room needed to complete the entire picture of the case. The cliffhanger didn't fall from Mercer, but from the investigator making notes on the report. He looked up, meeting Hayes's and Ayla's eyes through the frosted glass. "We have enough to forward the file to the district attorney." And from that moment on, the story was no longer about the misconduct that happened this morning. It had become a widening battle where the truth was not only being exposed but prepared to be carried into court, where every word would be examined under an unbiased light. And the wave the community had created was turning into a pressure no one could stop. When IA's final report was signed and sent to the district attorney, the entire system let out a dry, tightening screech like a sudden break. Everything happened so fast that even officers inside the precinct didn't expect that a single morning, just one confrontation on the sidewalk in front of a diner could crack the structure they once believed immovable. Holt had his gun confiscated right inside the interrogation room, his wrists locked in cuffs with a cold, sharp click. His face tightened for a moment, but he didn't argue, didn't shout like he had when pushing others onto the pavement. No sound left his mouth. His eyes were hollow, staring into nothing as if searching for an exit that no longer existed. Mercer was called out of the room at the same time. A superior officer removed the badge from his chest, placed it into a clear evidence bag, and handed it to IA. The metallic shine lay on the table like a piece of evidence instead of the emblem of authority that once made him walk with his shoulders squared. Mercer bowed his head the entire time, his hands clenched as if holding on to something that was dissolving in his palms. His final admission that Holt forced him to frame Walter made him feel lighter, but not enough to save him from suspension. Mercer knew that, and he didn't protest. Maybe because for the first time in years, he no longer wanted to run. As Holt was escorted out, a federal prosecutor was brought in for an emergency meeting. The salt and pepper-haired man, standing straight, placed a thick file onto the IA table. He read each line, cross-checked every piece of footage, then closed the file with a loud snap that echoed through the room. His gaze moved to Ayla before he spoke. Sufficient grounds for prosecution. The sentence was short, sharp, and carried the weight of an early verdict. It didn't just declare Holt wrong. It confirmed the system had allowed him to exist for far too long. When news of Holt's detention spread the neighborhood where everything began lit up like a crossroads of years of accumulated anger. Residents filled the front of City Hall before the sun even disappeared. They carried hand-drawn cardboard signs, the words messy but unmistakable, justice must be served, and no more silence. Even those who usually avoided crowds, the elderly in folding chairs, young men who had never protested, and families with children, stood together shoulder to shoulder as if proven they wouldn't back down this time. Many brought phones, still recording, still live streaming, still telling the rest of the state that this story would not end inside an investigation room. They spoke of Walter, of Eddie, of Ruth, and especially of Ayla, the woman who stood on the sidewalk without a tremor, even with two officers crowding her on both sides. The elders of the neighborhood had long told each other that justice in this city came and went, but this time they felt something truly shifting, not on paper, but inside themselves. Among the people gathered outside the courthouse, Walter appeared quietly in his old brown coat. He didn't speak much, only stopping to look at the tall doors where Holt would be brought in. Eddie stood beside him, arms crossed over his chest, like someone holding on to a calm he hadn't been able to keep years ago. When they looked at each other, neither said a word, but their presence alone was enough for the community to know that the truth was no longer strangled by fear. People around them began to recognize them from the clip, some placing a hand on Walter's shoulder with a smile, others shaking Eddie's hand and offering a few words of encouragement. Those simple moments linked the crowd together, making the air heavy but no longer suffocating. Ayla stood a short distance away beside Hayes. She wasn't part of the police department, so she wasn't allowed inside the work area. But Hayes brought her there to update her on the situation, and because he knew her presence was something this community needed to see. Ayla didn't search for anyone's eyes, didn't wave, didn't speak to the crowd. But simply by standing there, her steadiness spread into a quiet strength the vulnerable leaned on. A few people recognized her from the live stream and wanted to approach, but paused when they saw her composure. Even so, her presence made a young family nod to each other, as if confirming that trust could still be placed in the right hands. On the courthouse steps, the legal representatives from the civil rights organization stood with the prosecutor and the police chief during the media briefing. Reporters crowded in microphones, stretching forward like rows of branches reaching toward the same light. The police chief spoke briefly. "We are working with federal agencies to ensure the trial proceeds transparently and without bias." The prosecutor followed. "The actions involved no longer fall within internal discipline. This is criminal." The final words shifted the crowd from murmurs to a tight rising hope. For the first time in years, they felt the door in front of them wasn't being shut with excuses or vague reports. For the first time, they saw a man who abused power actually handcuffed, not warned or reassigned. Inside a conference room in the courthouse, the trial schedule was placed before the attorneys, police representatives, and IA. White paper, black letters, a red seal pressed into the page. Hayes received a copy, then handed it to Ayla as they stepped out. She looked at the line, centered on the sheet without furrow in her brow or sign. She read it like someone reading the coordinates of another mission she was about to step into. The trial date was set. That moment fell over the neighborhood like a drum beat into the earth. The crowd didn't cheer or erupt, but inhaled deeply and exhaled as if they had been holding their breath for far too long. People looked at one another at the courthouse, at the signs raised high, and at Ayla standing still beside Hayes. And they knew the next step would be the biggest one. The step where the truth would be brought into the light from which the abuser would have nowhere left to hide. On the morning of the first hearing, the city courthouse lit up earlier than usual. People lined both sides of the steps, familiar faces from the live stream from the working-class neighborhood, and even those who had never set foot here but were drawn into Ayla's story as if pulled by an invisible thread of justice. In that space, no one spoke loudly. No one made noise. Only low murmurs rose like waves before they crested. Ayla entered the courthouse with Hayes, her stride steady, her eyes not glancing left or right, but fixed forward as if every step matched the rhythm of someone who had once marched through darkness and was now walking into the light to speak the truth. The courtroom was packed and silent. On the witness bench, Eddie sat at the end, gripping his old cap tightly. Walter sat in front of him, his hands clasped the pulse at his wrist, beating hard as if trying to hold in the memories he knew he would have to say aloud. Holt was brought in through the back entrance. When he passed by, there was no arrogance or barking orders left in him, only a darkened face and eyes avoiding every gaze, like someone pushed out of a room where he once believed he held the power to shape others' lives. When the judge declared the court in session, the prosecutor stood first. He looked around, his gaze sweeping past Holt and stopping at Ayla's position. "Today," he said, voice low, "we are not judging a moment of poor judgment. We are judging a pattern of abuse that lasted for years, sheltered by authority and silence." The opening line froze the room. Holt lowered his head, his fingers tightening until they looked ready to snap. Ayla was called to the stand first. She stepped forward, her back as straight as when she stood before Hayes receiving her mission. Yet, her eyes softened as they passed over the people who had stood beside her throughout the investigation. When the prosecutor asked, "Can you recount the events of that morning?" Ayla didn't take a deep breath or brace herself as others might. She began speaking immediately, her tone calm but sharp, like a blade honed to the right edge. "I was carrying out a mission under sealed directive. I was disguised as a homeless woman to track the target moving near the diner." Her voice was steady, each word falling to the floor like rounds striking a target. "Officer Holt approached me without stating a reason. When I didn't react the way he wanted, he grabbed my collar, shoved me into the wall, causing an impact that triggered the SOS signal on my military watch." Ayla looked directly at Holt as she said this, not out of vengeance, but to confirm she remembered every action precisely. A few sharp inhales rippled through the room when the prosecutor played the diner camera footage on the large screen. The moment Holt yanked her collar, the moment he drove his knee into her back, the moment she was forced down onto the wet pavement, all of it was enlarged by the clarity of truth. A woman in the gallery lifted her hand to her mouth, and a man in the front row shook his head in disappointment. Holt didn't look up. He only bowed his head lower, damp hair falling over half of his pale face. The prosecutor asked Ayla, "At that point, did you threaten Officer Holt?" Ayla answered immediately, her voice steady. "Oh, did you resist?" "I only reacted when Mr. Walter's life was in danger." A brief silence spread and settled beneath the judge's bench like an acknowledgement that her answer left no room for twisting. When Ayla stepped down, Hayes's slight nod from the back row felt like an unspoken confirmation that she had acted correctly from beginning to end. Eddie was called next. He walked to the stand with his hands trembling lightly, not from fear, but from memories pulling him back to the days he most wanted to forget. The prosecutor asked Mr. Eddie Banks, "Can you recount the incident between you and Officer Holt last year?" Eddie drew in a deep breath, his eyes lifting from the wooden floor to Holt. Holt avoided that gaze like a man dodging a spotlight aimed directly at his darkest corner. He said, "I didn't deserve to breathe in this neighborhood," Eddie said, and his voice cracked exactly on the word breathe. The courtroom fell silent. "I didn't do anything. I was just asking for food. He shoved me into a wall so hard I heard my arm break." He lifted his left arm where bone had once been held together by a brace. "Then he forced me to sign a paper saying I fell on my own." An older woman in the gallery broke into tears. The young man beside her placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Eddie shed a tear but didn't turn away. "I stayed quiet because I was afraid. But she—" He looked at Ayla, his eyes softening. She stood up. "So I stood up too." The judge nodded like someone who had finally seen what he hoped to see in a courtroom, the truth standing on its own feet. Holt's face had turned a bluish pale, no longer holding the red snarling arrogance from that morning on the sidewalk, no longer carrying the contempt he once reserved for the vulnerable. He stared at his hands as if realizing they were the very evidence damning him, and nothing he said could wash that away. When Eddie stepped down, the room remained heavy with the silence left behind by his words. The prosecutor stepped forward again. He looked around, letting his gaze rest on each person before he spoke the final line of the morning's examination. "Your Honor, this was not a mistake," he said, each word clear and leaving no space for excuses. "This was intentional. This was deliberate, repeated conduct protected by power and by the fear forced upon the vulnerable." His voice wasn't loud, but it was strong enough to drain the last bit of color from Holt's face. His hair hung over his eyes, and with his uniform collar removed, he looked as if something were dragging him downward. He swallowed once, but the dry sound couldn't swallow the truth closing in on him from all sides. The judge tapped the gavel, lightly announcing a recess. Yet the sound rang out like a warning bell that the road ahead offered no place to hide. And as the morning session ended, everyone understood that what had been revealed was only the visible tip of a structure of power cracking from within. That afternoon, when the courtroom doors opened again, the atmosphere had changed entirely. There were no longer the anxious murmurs from the morning, no lingering looks of doubt or unease. Instead, here was the tight, steady silence of a community waiting for something it had hoped for through many years, the day a corrupt officer would be brought into the light. not through apologies or excuses, but through a clear legal judgment. The late-day sunlight slanted through the windows, stretching a long golden band across the wooden floor, as if time itself had paused to witness the closing of a story that had shaken an entire city. Holt was brought in first, his wrists still handcuffed. He no longer resembled the officer who had appeared that morning aggressive, smug, and drunk on his perceived authority. His face was pale, his eyes avoided every direction, and each step he took carried the weight of the countless wrongs he had forced onto people who had no strength to fight back. When he sat in the defendant's chair, the entire courtroom held its breath. Mercer sat beside him, not in cuffs, but with his fingers tightly interlaced, his expression heavy. He no longer looked at Holt, nor at anyone else. He only stared at the hands that once held a gun, once raised a badge, once committed things he no longer had the strength to justify. The judge entered and struck the gavel. The room stilled. The prosecutor rose his gaze as sharp as it had been when he opened the trial. He delivered the final summary, not long but cold enough to chill the spine of anyone listening. He spoke of the abuses of authority, the blows, the slurs, the buried reports, the wounds the system had allowed to exist for far too long. As his words filled the room, a few people bowed their heads, perhaps to hide tears or perhaps to keep their composure while hearing the truth laid out so starkly. When the prosecutor concluded, the judge opened the final case file, letting his eyes pass over each page before lifting his head. His voice rose slowly, each word clear like stones being set onto still water. Officer Derek Holt. He paused, looking directly at the defendant. Holt swallowed, but no sound escaped his throat. This court finds you guilty on 4 charges: assault, abuse of authority, racial discrimination, and obstruction of a federal operation. A sharp breath echoed somewhere in the back. Then the entire courtroom froze for exactly 1 second before the full weight of the verdict fell. Some covered their mouths, some cried softly, and others went still as though watching a door collapse in front of them. Holt sat motionless. His face drained, his eyes wide as if he could not believe what the judge had said. All the life he had lived inside the safety of authority, protected by supervisors and by the forced silence of powerless victims. But in this moment, that authority shattered like glass under a hammer. Each fracture reflecting a year he had crushed someone else's life beneath it. The judge continued, his voice steady and unwavering. You are permanently stripped of your duty and transferred to federal custody pending sentencing. The words cut through the room like a blade, severing the last threads of hope. Holt lowered his head, his shoulders trembling slightly, but no one in the courtroom felt pity. The fear that Walter, Eddie, and Ruth had carried for years finally fell back onto the person who had created it. Then the judge turned to Mercer. Officer Brian Mercer. Mercer shot to his feet by reflex. He was not trembling, but his breaths shortened like someone bracing for a truth he had avoided for years. Considering your cooperation and the value of your testimony, the judge said, the court demotes you and places you on long-term suspension. Your record will be reviewed again if you continue to cooperate fully. Mercer nodded, once his eyes wet, but without tears. He knew he was not innocent, but at least he had not turned away at the end, and that saved him from the path Holt had just fallen into. When the sentencing concluded, the judge struck the gavel, closing the session. But the next sound was not chairs shifting or footsteps leaving the hall. It was applause. Strong, resounding applause, not for victory, but for justice, the kind many believed they would never witness in this city. It rose to the ceiling, bounced off the floor, and spilled out the doors to the steps where people were still gathered. Ayla stood near the back when the verdict was spoken. She did not smile or lift her chin like a victorious fighter. She only let her shoulders loosen slightly, as if setting down a weight she had carried since that gray morning. Her eyes fixed on the doorway as Holt was escorted past her, not with hatred or satisfaction, but with the gaze of someone who had finished a necessary battle. Hayes stood beside her in silence like a commander overseeing an outcome that did not surprise him but carried more weight than he had anticipated. You did well, he said quietly. Ayla nodded, but her eyes stayed on the exit, not to watch Holt leave, but to see the neighborhood, the community, and the people who had stood with her. When the doors swung open and she stepped onto the courthouse steps, the applause rose again, not loud or unruly, but steady, war, and strong. Familiar faces in the crowd smiled at her, some raised a hand, some simply nodded. Walter stood among them, lifting the brim of his hat in a small gesture of respect for the woman who had saved him on a foggy morning. Eddie stood just behind him, his shoulders freer, his eyes bright as though he had reclaimed something once stolen. And Ayla walked forward, breathing deep, her shoulders relaxed as if she could finally leave this battleground without carrying the burdens that were never meant to be hers. A chapter had closed, though the story of justice she knew was far from over. But, at least today, justice had won. After the trial, when the crowd began to break into small clusters and the afternoon sun dipped behind the courthouse roof, Ayla left the main area through a side path leading to the small square behind the building. Hayes walked with her for a short distance, then stopped when he noticed a few people waiting on a stone bench. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a light touch, but enough for her to understand. "Go," he said quietly. "They're waiting for you." Ayla nodded once and walked toward the three people standing together, those she had unintentionally pulled into this battle but who had become the most human part of the story. Walter stood in the center, hands tucked into the pockets of his familiar brown coat, posture slightly bent from years of weather, but eyes bright like a porch light that had never gone out. Ruth stood to his right, both hands gripping the straps of the canvas bag she had carried through years of wandering. Eddie stood silently, on the left shoulder straight, his face lighter than it had been in a long time. They did not speak when she approached, and that silence made the moment more honest, more beautiful. Walter was the first to speak. His voice still trembled slightly, but it no longer carried the fear it had when he faced Holt on that gray morning. It was the tremor of emotion of a man who had lived nearly his whole life, believing he would never witness what he had witnessed today. "Thank you," he said, without embellishment. "If you hadn't stood up that day, I don't know what would have happened." He lifted his gaze to Ayla, and in his eyes there was nothing but sincere gratitude. Ayla looked at him, her expression balanced between the softness of a heart opening and the steel of someone trained to hold her emotions within boundaries. "I just did what was right," she replied. The words were light as breath, but carried the weight of the entire morning buried under cold fog. She did not claim to be a hero and did not want praise. What she had done to her was simply what needed to be done, even if it meant being grabbed, pinned against the pavement, or having her disguise torn apart as a shield ripped away. Ruth stepped closer and placed a hand on Ayla's arm, a thin hand but strong in the way of people who have survived nights without shelter. "You saved us more than you know," she said, her voice shaped by years of silence but now reclaiming the right to be heard. "You showed us we still matter, that we still have a voice." Ruth looked at Ayla as if seeing a piece of memory she wanted to hold forever, something to remind her that no matter where life had pushed her, someone had been willing to stand up. Eddie was the quietest of the three, but his eyes spoke more than words. When Ayla looked at him, he let out a long breath and gave a small relieved laugh, not loud, but full of release. "I never thought what happened to me would ever come into the light," he said, "but because of you, I don't have to avoid my own reflection anymore." He touched his left arm gently where bone had once been broken. "You helped me get back the part of me I thought was gone." Ayla didn't say much. She simply listened, her gaze softening bit by bit, as if every word they spoke was placing a small warmth onto her shoulders that she hadn't realized she still needed. Not praise, not admiration, but the small pieces of truth they had lived together. The three people standing before her represented exactly what she fought for, those who seemed small but had the strength to change the outcome of an entire trial. The late afternoon breeze rolled through, pushing a few dry leaves across the brick path. Ruth pulled her coat tighter, Walter tucked his chin into his scarf, and Eddie slipped his hands out of his pockets to rub his palms together. The sky shifted toward a pale violet, the dim light settling like mist. None of them wanted the moment to end, but they all knew it was time to leave. Ayla drew a long breath, then said slowly, "Thank you for standing with me." She said it not out of formality, but because she understood fully without Walter stepping between her and the cuffs, without Ruth speaking up even with shaking hands, without Eddie willing to reopen old wounds, today's justice would not have carried the weight it did. They were not just witnesses to the case, but witnesses to courage. Walter touched her hand lightly. "We stand it together," he said, then gave a small smile. "None of us is alone anymore." Eddie nodded in agreement, and Ruth gave Ayla's shoulder a gentle pat, as if passing a piece of the community's strength onto the back of the soldier. Ayla looked at them one last time, then stepped back. She turned toward the path leading to the open lot behind the courthouse. The way was lined with thin mist, the street lights above casting long, blurred streaks of pale gold. She began walking, her posture straight, but her pace slow each step, leaving the impression of a long day finally settling. No one followed her. No one called her name. They let her enter that mist the way one allows a soldier to return to her own thoughts. A cold breeze brushed her face, and Ayla tugged her collar gently, her eyes thoughtful as she looked ahead. The applause, the thanks, the verdicts all seemed to settle behind her, while before her lay a quiet stretch where she would have to reclaim her own calm. She knew the wounds on her body would heal, but the unseen ones from Walter's frightened eyes, Eddie's breaking voice, Ruth's trembling hands to Holt's vicious stare would remain in her memory. Pieces of darkness every soldier carries after leaving a battlefield. Ayla stepped into the drifting layer of mist, her breath merging with the cool air. Her expression was neither sorrowful nor fully relieved, but carried the contemplative weight of someone who had just passed through a necessary confrontation. One part of the battle was over, but the rest, the part about healing, always came slower, quieter, and far deeper, and she was ready to walk into it. In the days following the trial, the working-class neighborhood, once so quiet that people could hear the wind pass through the old metal signs, shifted its rhythm. Not into loud chaos, but into a low, steady stir. A new current of energy awakened after far too long being pressed down by fear and silence. The narrow alley in front of the diner, where the mist-covered confrontation had taken place, became a gathering point for stories people once only dared whisper in the dark, or after checking to be sure no officer was standing nearby. Residents began gathering each afternoon after work. They no longer passed one another with guarded eyes, no longer avoided each other's gaze out of fear of being dragged into trouble. Instead, they stood in small groups holding warm coffee or a simple sandwich, speaking in quiet but firm tones about the things that had once frightened them into feeling invisible. The first community meeting was held in the old cultural center at the end of the street, where the ceiling fan hummed softly and the dim yellow lights flickered as if caught in the pull of something larger than the room could contain. It was there that the neighborhood's first oversight group against abuse of authority was formed. Ordinary people, a carpenter, a cashier, a homemaker, an unemployed man, divided shifts among themselves to observe record and report any sign of misconduct from those in uniform. They carried nothing but phones, notebooks, and the belief that protecting one another was a responsibility of the community, not something to be handed off to anyone else. A young man stood and said, his voice still trembling, "We've waited too long, hoping someone would save us. Now we do it ourselves." No one objected. They weren't doing this to oppose the police, but to oppose the abuse that had made them fear the very street they lived on. A 70-year-old woman stood up, leaning on her cane, but speaking with steady conviction. "I've lived here 40 years. I've seen things I never dared speak about. Now I want to speak." The room fell silent for a few seconds before rising into a small but persistent round of applause. From there, the stories people had buried for years began coming into the light. A man was once forced to open his trunk in the middle of the night without explanation. A black woman stopped on the sidewalk simply for walking the wrong direction. A young boy was yelled at until he cried right at his own doorstep because he ran too close to a patrol car. Each person offered a different story, but together they formed a map of fear that had covered the neighborhood for far too long. And in that room, for the first time, those stories were not smothered by "don't talk about it," It's too much trouble. For the first time, they were heard without anyone feeling small. Walter sat in the front row, still holding the old hat he always kept. When he was invited to speak, he rose slowly, his posture slightly bent, like a man carrying a long past on his shoulders. But when he looked around the room, his eyes shone in a strange way, as if he were seeing himself on that misty morning, the trembling man who still stepped forward to stand between Ayla and the handcuffs. He drew a breath, then spoke with a steadier voice than in any moment he had ever dared to speak before. "We're not staying silent anymore." The words weren't loud, but they spread through the room like fire catching dry paper. Some people nodded, some cried, some turned to shake hands with the person beside them. "We're not staying silent anymore" wasn't just a slogan, but a vow spoken by someone who had once lived on the edge of fear. And when it came from Walter, a man the community had always seen as part of the neighborhood, it became a marker of true change. Eddie stepped forward to steady Walter as he sat down, their eyes meeting with a shared relief that didn't need words. Ruth stood leaning against the wall, nodding along to each story like an elder watching her children reclaim a voice they had lost. None of them thought of themselves as heroes. They were simply ordinary people taking back something they should have had long ago. And Ayla, standing far in the back of the room, quietly leaned against the wall watching everything from a spot no one noticed. She didn't want to be the center, didn't want to be looked at with admiration. She was there because Hayes told her she should witness this, the deepest outcome of a confrontation she once believed was only a personal mission. When Walter said, "We're not staying silent anymore," she felt her chest loosen as if a knot inside her had finally come undone. She looked at each face, people she had met in moments of chaos and fear, now standing tall in their own space. Her eyes softened, holding emotions she no longer had to hide. She understood that winning in court was one part of justice. But the greater victory was this moment when people who once trembled at the sound of a siren now dared to speak memories covered by cruelty. When a community used to enduring quietly now stood up to protect one another, when a story that began with discrimination, violence, and fear ended with strength from those who once believed they had none. Ayla looked at them one last time before leaving the room, her hand brushing the wooden doorframe as she lifted her head and stepped outside. The street lights had begun to glow, casting warm gold across the old buildings. She let out a small smile, rare but real, as Walter's words echoed in her mind. "We're not staying silent anymore." And this time, Ayla believed they truly never would. As Ayla left the neighborhood, the low buildings receded behind her like the final period of a chapter closing. The military vehicle, carrying her back to base, moved smoothly along wider, cleaner streets with a rhythm completely different from the place she had just left. But in her mind, every image from that gray morning still stood vividly like a streak of light that refused to fade Walter's terrified eyes when the handcuffs were inches from his face. Ruth's trembling hand touching hers, the quiet break in Eddie's voice as he recounted his past. Those pieces followed her like sharp, silent fragments, not to hurt her, but to remind her of something far more important than the mission she had been assigned. The base gate appeared beyond a row of dark pine trees. When the vehicle stopped, Ayla stepped out. Her boot, still dusted with the city's grit, clicked onto the clean concrete of the compound, creating a stark contrast. The air here lived in discipline and order, far from the shouts, the clatter of cuffs, and the threatening fear of the labor district. Yet, amid that precision, Hayes stood waiting as if he knew exactly when she would return from everything she had just carried. His arms were folded, his face wearing the familiar sternness of a seasoned commander, but his eyes held a quietness that told Ayla he wasn't here as a superior checking on a subordinate, but as someone who understood the weight of what she had just overcome. "You did well," Chief Hayes said, neither grand nor heavy, just 6 words, but enough for her to feel the respect he held for her. Not the kind built on rank or combat achievements, but on the fact that she had used her own resilience to pull an entire community out of the darkness they had lived under for too long. Ayla straightened, giving a small nod. She didn't answer immediately, instead, letting her eyes move across the base like someone trying to regain a familiar rhythm after returning from a battlefield, though this battlefield hadn't been in a desert or a jungle, but on a cold, wet sidewalk in front of a diner in a struggling neighborhood. When she looked toward the open courtyard where the last light of day stretched across the ground in long, pale gold lines, she said, "Justice isn't easy, but it's worth the fight." After speaking, she felt a small release inside, as if she had finally returned a missing piece to its proper place. The justice she meant wasn't the verdict in court or the sentence handed to Holt. The real justice was in people who once bowed their heads, now standing upright in stories once forgotten being brought into the light in a small neighborhood long accustomed to silence, deciding it would not be silent anymore. Hayes looked at her for a few seconds more, then turned and walked down the main hallway, signaling her to follow. "There's more work ahead," he said without looking back, "and you know better than anyone fighting never really stops." Ayla followed the light tap of her boots on the floor, forming the steady rhythm of someone ready to return to duty. She walked past walls lined with photos of teammates, faces stern in old operations. Each face held its own story, but as her eyes moved over them, she recognized the same truth in all of them. None of them fought for recognition. They fought for places no one noticed, for people no one protected, for battles never marked on military maps, but etched deeply into everyday lives. Entering the command room, Ayla saw a new file placed neatly on the desk. She didn't need to open it to know it was her next assignment. Sealed transitions were always this fast. But this time before, reaching for the file, she paused, a rare hesitation for someone like her. In her mind flickered the image of Walter, standing between her and the cuffs, Ruth eyeing. "You gave us our voice back." Eddie laughing softly as he confessed he no longer had to hide from himself. Those faces reminded her that sometimes a mission wasn't written inside a folder. Sometimes it rose right in the street in the eyes of someone asking for help without saying a word. She touched the file, felt the thickness of the pages, then took it in hand like someone holding a promise. Hayes stood near the doorway watching her, saying nothing, but the slow nod he gave told her he understood everything. Ayla stepped out into the hallway and headed toward the yard. The sun was nearly gone, the sky turning a deep orange that washed the compound in an uncommon calm. A soft breeze moved past, carrying the scent of dry leaves and a trace of dust. She stood there for a moment, letting the last warmth of the day settle on her face, as if she wanted to hold on to the feeling of something that had changed forever. Then she closed her eyes for a brief second, letting the final thought of the day settle in her mind, a sentence she didn't say aloud but knew was true of the battle she had just fought. "Some battles are fought right on the street where the bravest person is the one who doesn't bow their head." When Ayla opened her eyes, she was ready for the new mission. Her shadow stretched long across the yard, merging with the fading light, a reminder that even though she had left that neighborhood behind her, legacy remained there, carried in the breath of the people who had learned to stand up. One chapter had closed, but the shadow of the justice she had defended would linger for a long time in battles not everyone would see. As the last light fell over the base, Ayla stood still, looking out across the wide training field as if she were seeing the entire journey she had just walked. From the gray morning on the sidewalk of a poor neighborhood to the moment she stepped back through the military gate, everything flowed into one continuous line, no longer scattered pieces of conflict, but a complete story of courage, fear, confrontation, and the rising strength of people who once seemed the smallest of all. Each face in her memory carried its own mark every moment, leaving an echo that settled quietly in her chest. Ayla remembered clearly Holt's first look at her, the dismissive stare he gave when he thought she was a harmless, homeless woman, then the rough tugs, the insults sharp enough to wound anyone deeply. But what haunted her wasn't the brutality. It was the moment Walter, trembling, stood in front of her like a fragile but determined shield. Then Ruth, with a soft but steady voice, stepped up to confirm she had been honored before. Eddie, carrying old injuries, chose to reveal reveal the truth so no one else would suffer what he had endured. They weren't in uniform. They had no special training, yet they stood up in the moment that mattered most. That was what Ayla carried into the courtroom. Even though Holt faced severe charges and Mercer had to pay for following wrongdoing, she didn't see them as enemies, but as reflections of long-ignored fractures within a system everyone had grown used to looking away from. Justice wasn't just in the sentencing, but in the truth brought into the light and people realizing they didn't have to bow their heads when treated unfairly. When the applause rose after the verdict, Ayla felt that more clearly than ever. After the trial, the working-class neighborhood changed slowly but surely. People no longer walked past one another in silence. They shared stories buried for years, and they built watch groups to protect each other. Walter stood before everyone and said, "We're not staying silent anymore," a simple line that became the mark of an awakening. Ayla watched from afar, and her eyes carried relief mixed with pride. Not pride in herself, but in witnessing a community reclaim a voice they once lost. When Ayla returned to the base, Hayes said, "You did well, Chief," but she knew that doing well wasn't about completing a mission. It was about holding on to humanity amid collisions of power and injustice. She understood that the real battles weren't always fought far away, but right on a street corner between people where a trembling word or a breaking voice was sometimes braver than any command. From that story came lessons that would not fade. That a contemptuous look can wound, but an act of standing up can save an entire community. That strength doesn't always belong to the loudest, but sometimes to the one who dares to say stop. That justice doesn't arrive unless someone clears the way for it. That ordinary people like Walter, Ruth, and Eddie, those who seem the most vulnerable, can be the very source of change. And that if one person stands straight, a whole neighborhood can rise with them. Ayla knew her road ahead was still long, still filled with missions, still far from easy. But after that confrontation, she understood more clearly what she had always believed: courage isn't the absence of fear, it's standing up even when you know the cost. And justice, no matter how difficult, is always worth fighting for. Before stepping into the operations wing, she looked up at the evening sky one last time, carrying the sentence she would take into every mission that followed. Some battles are fought right on the street where the bravest person is the one who doesn't bow their head.